The autumn morning in Nashville, Tennessee, painted the city in warm shades of amber and gold. Daniel Matthews adjusted his rearview mirror for the third time in 10 minutes and checked his Uber app again. At 10:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, rides weren't exactly pouring in, but every dollar counted these days. Daniel was 38 years old, with weathered hands that told the story of a man who had worked hard his entire life. His dark hair, now streaked with premature gray at the temples, caught the morning sunlight filtering through his Honda Civic's windshield. The car wasn't new by any stretch, a 2016 model with 180,000 miles on it, but it ran reliably, and that was all that mattered right now. 6 months ago, Daniel had been working as a mechanical engineer at Bridgestone's Nashville facility. Good pay, solid benefits, and a future that seemed secure. Then came the layoffs. Restructuring, they called it. Nothing personal, his supervisor had said while handing him the severance package. But when you're a single father with a sick child, everything becomes personal. His phone buzzed with a notification, a ride request from Music Row, Nashville's legendary district where dreams were made and sometimes broken. The pickup location was Ocean Way, Nashville Studios, one of the most prestigious recording facilities in the city. Daniel had driven past it countless times, but never imagined he'd be picking someone up there. Probably another wannabe musician, he muttered to himself, though not unkindly. Nashville was full of hopeful artists, and Daniel had transported his fair share of them over the past 6 months. Some were heading to their first recording session, eyes bright with possibility. Others were leaving what might be their last, shoulders heavy with disappointment. As he navigated through the familiar streets, Daniel's mind wandered to Emma, his 12-year-old daughter. She was at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital right now, receiving her weekly chemotherapy treatment. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctors had delivered that diagnosis 8 months ago, and Daniel's world had tilted on its axis. Emma had always been his little ray of sunshine. Even now, bald from the chemo and wearing a bright pink bandana that she'd decorated with glitter, she maintained an optimism that both inspired and broke his heart. She loved music, especially country music, and had inherited Daniel's appreciation for the classics. George Strait, Patsy Cline, Johnny Cash, she knew them all. "Dad, when I get better, I want to learn to play guitar like the cowboys in the old songs," she had told him just last week, her small hand in his as the IV drip slowly delivered the medicine that was both poison and salvation. "When you get better," he had promised, squeezing her hand gently, "we'll get you the prettiest guitar in all of Nashville." But guitars cost money, and money was something Daniel was rapidly running out of. The medical bills were mounting despite insurance, and the modest savings he'd accumulated over the years were disappearing faster than morning dew in the Tennessee sun. Driving for Uber brought in some income, but it was barely enough to cover the basics, let alone the mounting medical expenses. He pulled into the parking lot of Ocean Way Studios, a nondescript building that housed some of the most sophisticated recording equipment in the world. The autumn leaves crunched under his tires as he parked near the entrance. According to the app, his passenger's name was J. Smith, probably a pseudonym. Many of his celebrity passengers used fake names for privacy. Daniel had picked up a few semi-famous musicians over the past months. A couple of rising country stars, a few session players, even a songwriter who'd penned hits for some big names. None of them had been particularly memorable, though they'd all been polite enough. The studio door opened, and a man in his 70s stepped out. He wore dark jeans, a crisp white shirt, and a black cowboy hat that was unmistakably authentic. Not the costume variety that tourists wore on Broadway. There was something familiar about his posture, the confident but unhurried way he moved, but Daniel couldn't quite place it. The man opened the back door and settled into the seat with the ease of someone accustomed to being driven places. He was carrying a leather guitar case that had seen its share of miles, Afternoon, the man said, his voice carrying a distinctive Texas drawl. Hope I didn't keep you waiting long. No problem at all, sir, Daniel replied, glancing in the rearview mirror. Where are we headed today? The man consulted his phone. The Grand Ole Opry house, if you don't mind. Got a meeting there in about an hour. Daniel's pulse quickened slightly. The Grand Ole Opry was sacred ground in Nashville, the mother church of country music. Anyone with a meeting there was definitely not just another wannabe musician. Certainly, sir. That's about a 20-minute drive from here, traffic permitting. As Daniel pulled out of the parking lot and merged into the midday traffic on Music Row, he found himself stealing glances at his passenger in the rearview mirror. There was definitely something familiar about the man, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The cowboy hat cast shadows across his face, making identification difficult. The radio was tuned to a classic country station, and as they drove, Merle Haggard's Mama Tried filled the comfortable silence. Daniel noticed his passenger's fingers tapping along with the rhythm on the leather guitar case. Good music, the man commented. They don't make them like Merle anymore. No, sir, they sure don't, Daniel agreed. My daughter and I listen to a lot of the classics. She's got better taste in music than most kids her age. How old is she? 12. Daniel paused, not sure why he was sharing personal information with a stranger. But something about the man's voice invited conversation. She's going through a tough time right now, but music helps her get through it. Music has a way of doing that, the man said quietly. It's gotten me through some pretty rough patches myself, Daniel nodded, feeling an unexpected connection with his passenger. As they continued through the city, the conversation flowed naturally. The man asked about Nashville, about the changes Daniel had seen in the city over the years. Daniel found himself talking more openly than he had with a stranger in months. I've been here most of my life, Daniel explained, as they passed the historic RCA Studio B. Watched it grow from a big town to a real city. Sometimes I miss the old Nashville, when it felt more like a community. Change is inevitable, I suppose, the man replied, but the heart of a place that stays the same if you know where to look for it. There was wisdom in those words that resonated with Daniel. Despite all the challenges he was facing, Nashville was still home. Emma was still his bright light, and music was still the thread that connected them to something larger than their immediate struggles. As they approached the Grand Ole Opry house, Daniel found himself wishing the ride would last longer. It had been months since he'd had such an easy, comfortable conversation with anyone outside of Emma's medical team. Here we are, sir, Daniel said as he pulled into the circular drive in front of the iconic venue. The man reached for his wallet, but before he could pull out any cash, Daniel's phone rang. It was Vanderbilt Children's Hospital, Emma's treatment center. His heart immediately jumped to his throat. I'm sorry, sir. I need to take this, Daniel said, his voice tight with worry. Of course, the man replied, settling back into his seat. Daniel answered the phone with trembling fingers. Hello? This is Daniel Matthews. Mr. Matthews, this is Jennifer Wilson, Emma's nurse. Everything is fine, she said quickly, clearly recognizing the panic in his voice. Emma finished her treatment early today, and she's asking when you'll be here to pick her up. Relief flooded through Daniel like cool water. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Tell her Daddy's on his way. I will. She's been entertaining the other kids with stories about you driving celebrities around Nashville. She's quite proud of her dad. Daniel smiled despite the stress that had gripped him moments before. Tell her I love her, and I'll see her soon. He hung up and turned to apologize to his passenger, but found the man watching him with the expression of genuine concern. Everything all right? The man asked. Yes, sir. Thank you for your patience. My daughter? She's in the hospital, and when they call... Daniel's voice trailed off. I understand completely, the man said gently. Children are everything, aren't they? They are, sir. They really are. The man handed Daniel a $20 bill for what should have been a $12 fare. "Keep the change, and give my regards to your daughter." "Thank you, sir. That's very kind of you." As the man got out of the car, Daniel found himself watching in the rear-view mirror. There was still something naggingly familiar about him, but the urgency of getting to Emma pushed the thought aside. Daniel put the car in drive and headed toward Vanderbilt Children's Hospital, unaware that he had just transported one of country music's greatest living legends, and that their paths would cross again in a way that would change both of their lives forever. Vanderbilt Children's Hospital stood like a beacon of hope against the Nashville skyline, its modern architecture and colorful exterior designed to be less intimidating to young patients and their families. Daniel had spent countless hours within its walls over the past 8 months, and he knew every hallway, every elevator, every corner where worried parents gathered to steal moments of privacy for their fears and tears. The pediatric oncology ward was on the 5th floor, and Daniel's steps echoed in the familiar rhythm he'd developed over months of visits. Left at the nurses' station, right past the playroom, where brave children with bald heads and bright smiles played video games between treatments, straight to room 517, where Emma waited for him. She was sitting cross-legged on the hospital bed, wearing her favorite pink bandana, the one decorated with silver glitter that caught the light when she moved. Her coloring book was spread across her lap, and she was carefully filling in what appeared to be a horse with purple and blue crayons. "Daddy!" she exclaimed when she saw him, her face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that made all of Daniel's struggles worthwhile. "Hey there, sunshine!" he said, crossing to her bed and planting a gentle kiss on her forehead. "How did the treatment go today?" "It was okay," she replied, with the matter-of-fact tone she'd developed when discussing her medical procedures. "Mrs. Wilson said I was the bravest patient she had today, and guess what? I made a new friend." Emma pointed across the room to another bed where a boy about her age was reading. His head was also covered with a colorful bandana, and he looked up when Emma called his name. "Daddy, this is Tyler Harrison. Tyler, this is my dad, the one I told you about, who drives famous people around Nashville." Tyler waved shyly. Daniel walked over and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Tyler. I'm Daniel." "Tyler's from Kentucky," Emma continued excitedly. "He's here for treatment too, but he's staying at the Ronald McDonald House because his family lives far away." Daniel felt his heart clench. The Ronald McDonald House provided temporary housing for families of children receiving medical treatment. But it meant Tyler's parents had to uproot their entire lives to be here. At least Daniel had the comfort of his own home to return to each night. "How long have you been in Nashville, Tyler?" Daniel asked. 3 weeks, the boy replied quietly. "My mom and dad take turns staying with me. Dad had to go back to work, so it's just Mom and me right now." Daniel recognized the strain in the boy's voice. He'd heard it in his own voice countless times over the past months. The weight of illness, of disrupted lives, of uncertain futures, it aged children far beyond their years. "Well, you're in good hands here," Daniel assured him. "And Emma's right. The doctors and nurses here are the best in the world." As Emma gathered her coloring books and the small bag of personal items she brought to each treatment, she chattered about her day. She told him about the therapy dog that had visited, about the art project she'd completed in the children's activity room, about the lunch that had actually tasted good for once. Daniel marveled at her resilience. Where he saw mounting medical bills and uncertain futures, she saw therapy dogs and art projects. Where he felt overwhelmed by the complexity of insurance forms and treatment schedules, she found joy in small victories and new friendships. "Dad, I told Tyler about how you drove that musician from the big recording studio today," Emma said as they gathered her things. "He plays guitar, too." "Oh, really?" Daniel looked over at Tyler with renewed interest. Tyler nodded, suddenly more animated. I've been playing since I was 8. My grandpa taught me. I brought my guitar with me, but... He glanced around the sterile hospital room. It doesn't seem right to play it in here. Why not? Emma asked. Music makes everything better. Right, Dad? Daniel smiled. Your daughter has a point, Tyler. If you'd like to play, I'm sure the other kids would love to hear some music. Tyler's face brightened. Really? You think it would be okay? I'll ask Mrs. Wilson, Emma offered, already heading toward the door. She loves music too. As Emma bounded out to find the nurse, Daniel sat down in the chair beside Tyler's bed. The boy's guitar case was tucked beside his bedside table, and Daniel could see it was well worn, the kind of wear that came from years of love and use, not neglect. What kind of music do you like to play? Daniel asked. Mostly country, Tyler replied. My grandpa loved the old stuff, George Strait, Alan Jackson, Garth Brooks. He said they told stories that mattered, not just sang pretty words. Daniel felt a familiar warmth at the mention of George Strait. The king of country had been the soundtrack to some of the most important moments in his own life. His wedding to Sarah, Emma's birth. Even the difficult days after Sarah's death in a car accident when Emma was just 4 years old. Your grandpa had good taste, Daniel said. George Strait is one of the greatest storytellers in music history. Tyler's eyes lit up. Do you know Amarillo Morning? That was Grandpa's favorite song. He used to say it reminded him of his childhood in Texas. I know it well, Daniel replied. It's one of Emma's favorites too. Emma returned with Jennifer Wilson, the head nurse of the pediatric oncology unit. Mrs. Wilson was in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering, but somehow maintained their warmth and compassion. I hear we might have a concert this afternoon, she said with a smile. Tyler plays guitar, and he's really good, Emma announced. Can he play for everyone? Mrs. Wilson looked thoughtful. You know what? I think that's a wonderful idea. We could set up in the playroom. Some of the other children are finishing their treatments for the day, and I think they'd love some live music. Tyler looked uncertain. I don't know. What if I'm not good enough? What if the other kids don't like it? Daniel leaned forward. Tyler, music isn't about being perfect. It's about sharing something that comes from your heart. And from what Emma tells me, and from what I can see, you've got a good heart. 20 minutes later, the hospital playroom had been transformed into an intimate concert venue. 7 children of various ages, all in different stages of their cancer treatments, sat in a semicircle around Tyler. Parents and medical staff had gathered as well, creating an audience of about 15 people. Tyler sat on a small chair, his acoustic guitar cradled in his arms. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the tuning, but when he looked up and saw Emma's encouraging smile, some of his nervousness seemed to fade away. My grandpa taught me this song, he said quietly. He said it was about hope and new beginnings. The first chords of Amarillo Morning filled the small room, and Tyler's voice, clear and pure despite his youth and illness, carried the familiar melody. Daniel watched as the faces around the room began to soften and smile. A toddler clapped along with the rhythm. A teenage girl closed her eyes and swayed gently to the music. But it was Emma's face that caught Daniel's attention most. She was looking at Tyler with such admiration and joy that it took Daniel's breath away. For a moment, the hospital room faded away, and there was only the music and the connection it created between these children who had faced more challenges than most adults ever would. When Tyler finished the song, the room erupted in applause. Encouraged by the response, he played 2 more songs, Friends in Low Places, and a beautiful rendition of Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain that left several adults wiping away tears. That was beautiful, Tyler, Mrs. Wilson said when he had finished. I think you've given everyone here a gift today. As the impromptu concert ended and families began to disperse, Daniel found himself thinking about the power of music to transform a moment, to lift spirits, to create connection in the midst of isolation and fear. It was something he'd always known intellectually, but witnessing it firsthand in this setting gave it new meaning. Emma hugged Tyler goodbye, promising to listen for his guitar playing during her next visit. As they walked to the elevator, she was practically bouncing with excitement. "Dad, wasn't that amazing? Tyler is so talented. And did you see how happy everyone looked when he was playing?" "I did see that, Sunshine. Music really does make everything better, doesn't it?" "Just like you always say," she agreed. "Dad, when I get better, do you think Tyler and I could play music together sometime? He could teach me guitar, and I could learn to sing harmony like the old country duets you play in the car." Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. "When you get better," he said, echoing the promise he'd made before. "I think that would be wonderful." As they drove home through the busy Nashville streets, Emma chatted about Tyler, about music, about her plans for when her treatment was finished. Daniel listened with one ear while his mind processed the day's events. The mysterious passenger from Ocean Way Studios, Tyler's impromptu concert, Emma's unwavering optimism in the face of her illness. It all seemed connected somehow, though he couldn't quite understand how. What he did understand was that despite all the challenges they were facing, moments like these reminded him of what truly mattered. Not the mounting bills or the uncertain future, but the connections between people, the power of hope, and the way music could bridge any gap between hearts. Emma fell asleep in the passenger seat before they reached home, her head resting against the window, a small smile still playing on her lips. Daniel glanced over at her peaceful face and felt the familiar surge of love and determination that had carried him through the darkest months of their journey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had music and each other, and for now, that was enough. 3 days later, Daniel was back on the streets of Nashville, navigating the afternoon traffic with the practiced ease of someone who had driven these roads thousands of times. The weather had turned cooler, with grey clouds gathering overhead and the promise of rain in the air. It was the kind of day that made people want to stay indoors, but Daniel couldn't afford that luxury. Emma had another treatment scheduled for Monday, and he needed every fare he could get. His phone chimed with a ride request, and Daniel glanced at the pickup location, the Country Music Hall of Fame. Another high-profile location, though that didn't necessarily mean anything in Nashville. The Hall of Fame was as much a tourist destination as it was a professional venue, and Daniel had picked up everyone from wide-eyed visitors from Ohio to industry executives heading to important meetings. The passenger name showed as G. King, another likely pseudonym. Daniel had learned not to get his hopes up about celebrity passengers. Most of the time, the interesting names turned out to be regular people who just preferred privacy, or occasionally someone with an inflated sense of their own importance. He pulled up to the curb in front of the Hall of Fame's distinctive architecture, with its sweeping lines and piano key pattern that made it one of Nashville's most recognizable buildings. The sidewalk was busy with tourists, and Daniel scanned the crowd for someone who looked like they might be waiting for an Uber. A man emerged from the building's main entrance, and Daniel felt a jolt of recognition, though he still couldn't quite place where he'd seen him before. It was the same passenger from Ocean Way Studios, the man with the black cowboy hat and leather guitar case. The man with the Texas drawl who had tipped generously and asked about Emma. The man approached the car and tapped on the passenger window. When Daniel rolled it down, the man smiled. "We meet again," he said. "I hope you don't mind that I requested you specifically. I was hoping we might continue our conversation from the other day." Daniel was surprised and pleased. In 6 months of driving for Uber, he'd never had a passenger specifically request him for a return trip. "Of course, sir, I'm honored. Where are we headed today?" The man settled into the back seat, placing his guitar case beside him as he had before. "The Bluebird Cafe, if you know it." Daniel definitely knew it. The Bluebird Cafe was legendary in Nashville circles, a small, intimate venue that had launched countless careers and hosted some of the most important songwriters in country music history. It was the kind of place where industry professionals went to hear new material and discover emerging talent. Absolutely, sir. That's about a 15-minute drive. As they pulled away from the curb, Daniel found himself stealing glances in the rearview mirror, trying to place his passenger's face. There was something about the man's profile, the way he held himself, that tickled the edge of Daniel's memory. "How's your daughter doing?" the man asked, settling comfortably into the seat. Daniel was touched that he remembered. "She's doing well, thank you for asking. She had a good week, actually. Made a new friend at the hospital and got to hear some live music during one of her treatments." "Music in a hospital," the man mused. "That sounds like exactly what those kids need." "It really was something special," Daniel continued, feeling the same warmth he'd experienced watching Tyler play. "This boy, Tyler, played guitar for all the children in the ward. You should have seen their faces light up. Emma was absolutely enchanted." The man leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. "What kind of music did he play?" "Country classics mostly. Started with Amarillo Morning and went from there. The kid has real talent, and more importantly, he understands what music can do for people who are hurting." "Amarillo Morning," the man repeated quietly. "That's a good choice. A song about hope and new beginnings." Daniel glanced in the mirror and caught something in the man's expression, a look of deep satisfaction, as if he'd heard something that pleased him profoundly. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking," Daniel said as they stopped at a red light, "are you in the music business? You seem to know a lot about it, and picking you up at Ocean Way Studios, and now the Hall of Fame." The man chuckled. "You could say I've been involved with music for most of my life. What about you? Do you play?" "Not really," Daniel admitted. "I can strum a few chords on guitar, but nothing serious. My late wife, Sarah, she was the musical one in our family. Had a beautiful voice. She used to sing Emma to sleep every night." "I'm sorry for your loss," the man said gently. "Thank you. It's been 8 years now, but sometimes it still feels like yesterday. Especially when Emma gets that look on her face when she hears a particularly beautiful song. She looks exactly like her mother in those moments." They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the radio playing softly in the background. A George Strait song came on, Check Yes or No, and Daniel automatically reached to turn up the volume, then caught himself. "Sorry," he said. "I hope you don't mind country music. Emma and I are big fans of the classics." "Don't apologize," the man said. "I love this song. George Strait is one of the greatest." "Emma's favorite is I Cross My Heart," Daniel shared. "She says it reminds her of her parents' love story. I used to tell her about how that song was playing when I proposed to her mother." Daniel noticed the man shift slightly in the back seat, but when he looked in the mirror, his passenger was gazing out the window at the passing Nashville scenery. "That's from a movie, isn't it?" the man asked. "Pure country, I think." "That's right. Not the greatest movie ever made, but the soundtrack was incredible. Emma's watched it probably 50 times. She loves the story about the country star who loses his way and finds himself again through music." As they approached the Bluebird Cafe, Daniel found himself wishing once again that the ride could last longer. There was something about this passenger that put him at ease, made him want to share stories and memories he rarely talked about with strangers. The Bluebird Cafe sat unassumingly in a small strip mall, its modest exterior giving no hint of the musical magic that happened within its walls. Daniel had driven past it countless times, but had never been inside. Tickets were notoriously hard to get, and even when they were available, they were expensive, a luxury he couldn't justify given his current circumstances. "Here we are," Daniel said as he pulled into the small parking lot. The man made no immediate move to get out, Instead, he sat quietly for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Daniel," he said finally, "I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." "Of course, sir. When you look at me, do you recognize me at all? Beyond our meeting the other day, I mean." Daniel studied the man's reflection in the rearview mirror more carefully. There was definitely something familiar about him, the shape of his face, the way he carried himself, something about his voice, but he couldn't quite connect the dots. "I feel like I should," Daniel admitted. "There's something familiar about you, but I can't quite place it. Are you someone I should recognize?" The man smiled, and in that smile, something clicked in Daniel's mind. It was like looking at a photograph that had been slightly out of focus and suddenly seeing it clearly. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The cowboy hat, the Texas drawl, the easy confidence, the knowledge of music, the guitar case, it all came together in a moment of stunning clarity. "Oh my God," Daniel whispered, his hands gripping the steering wheel. You're George Strait." The man, George Strait, the king of country music himself, nodded slowly. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." Daniel's mind reeled. He had been driving George Strait around Nashville, the man whose music had been the soundtrack to his life, whose songs had comforted him through his wife's death and Emma's diagnosis, whose voice had filled their small house on countless evenings when Daniel needed hope more than his next breath. I should have recognized. Emma is never going to believe this," Daniel stammered. "Emma's your daughter who loves I Cross My Heart?" "Yes, sir. She's your biggest fan. We both are. Your music, it's gotten us through some really tough times." George smiled warmly. "Tell me about Emma. Tell me about her fight." And so Daniel did. Sitting in the parking lot of the Bluebird Cafe with his idol in the back seat, he opened his heart and shared their story. He told George about Emma's diagnosis, about the long nights in hospital rooms, about the mounting medical bills, and the constant fear that lived in his chest like a stone. He talked about losing his job, about swallowing his pride to drive for Uber, about the way Emma never complained despite everything she was going through. He shared how music, particularly George's music, had become their anchor in the storm. When she was first diagnosed, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, she was so scared. We were both so scared. But that first night in the hospital, Amarillo Morning came on the radio, and she asked me to sing it with her. By the end of the song, she was smiling again. She said if cowboy songs were about hope and new beginnings, then maybe her story could have a happy ending too. George listened to every word, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail of their journey. "How old did you say she was?" George asked. 12. She'll be 13 in January if..." Daniel's voice trailed off. He'd learned not to make assumptions about the future. If what? If the treatment works, if we can afford to continue the treatment, if a dozen things go right that are mostly out of my control. George was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Daniel, I want to meet Emma." Daniel turned around in his seat to face George directly. "Sir, I want to meet your daughter. Would that be something she'd like?" Daniel felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Mr. Strait, that would mean everything to her, but I couldn't ask you to..." "You're not asking, I'm offering. I have some time this evening before my meeting. Could you take me to see her?" Daniel looked at this man, this legend who could have any luxury in the world, who could spend his time with celebrities and industry moguls, who had no obligation to care about the struggles of an Uber driver and his sick daughter, and saw genuine compassion and concern. "She's at the hospital right now," Daniel said. "She has treatments on Fridays. I was planning to pick her up after this ride." "Then that's perfect. Would you mind if I tagged along?" As they sat in that parking lot, Daniel felt something shift in his chest. For months, he'd been carrying the weight of their struggles alone, feeling isolated and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. But in this moment, he realized he wasn't alone anymore. George Strait, the king of country music, wanted to meet his daughter. The ride to Vanderbilt Children's Hospital was surreal. Daniel kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to wake up from what had to be an elaborate dream. But George was really there, asking questions about Emma's treatment, about her interests, about what songs she loved most. "Does she know about Tyler, the boy who played guitar at the hospital?" George asked. "Oh yes, she talks about him constantly. She's convinced they're going to start a band together when they both get better." George smiled. "I'd like to meet him too, if possible." When they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Daniel's heart was racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Emma was about to meet her hero, and he had no idea how she would react. As they walked through the hospital corridors toward the pediatric oncology ward, George asked quietly, "Does she know I'm coming?" "No, sir. I thought it might be better as a surprise." "Good thinking," George agreed. "Surprises can be magic when they're the right kind." They reached the 5th floor, and Daniel's hands were trembling as he led George toward Emma's room. He could hear her voice from the hallway. She was singing softly, her sweet voice carrying the melody of Amarillo Morning. Daniel paused outside the door, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was about to happen. George placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he said quietly. "Children have a way of handling magic better than adults do." Daniel knocked softly on the doorframe and stepped into the room. Emma was sitting up in her hospital bed, wearing her favorite purple bandana today, this one decorated with tiny silver stars. She had her coloring book open and was carefully working on a picture of a horse running through a field. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, looking up with her trademark bright smile. "You're early. I was just thinking about Tyler's concert and how I want to learn that song he played." "Speaking of music, sunshine," Daniel said, his voice barely steady, "I brought someone with me who I think you'd like to meet." George stepped into the room, removing his cowboy hat as he did so. For a moment, Emma just stared at him, her crayon frozen in mid-air. Her eyes grew wide and Daniel could see the recognition dawning on her face. "No way," she whispered. "No way, no way, no way." George smiled and walked slowly toward her bed. "Hello, Emma. I'm George Strait. Your dad tells me you're quite a country music fan." Emma's coloring book fell from her lap as her hands flew to cover her mouth. Tears immediately began streaming down her cheeks, and for a moment Daniel was worried she might be frightened or overwhelmed. But then she spoke, her voice muffled by her hands, but filled with pure joy. "You're really here. You're really, really here." "I'm really here," George confirmed, settling into the chair beside her bed. "And I hear you've been going through quite an adventure." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself, but failing spectacularly. "I can't believe this is happening." "Dad, are you seeing this? George Strait is in my hospital room." Daniel was fighting back tears of his own as he watched his daughter's face transform with happiness. In 8 months of treatments, procedures, and difficult days, he had never seen her look quite like this, as if all the pain and fear had been temporarily erased by pure wonder. "Emma," George said gently, "your father told me about your love for music and about how brave you've been. I also heard about a young man named Tyler who played guitar for you and the other children here." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Tyler is amazing. He played Amarillo Morning, and it was so beautiful. He made everyone smile, even the kids who were feeling really sick." "That's the power of music," George said. "It can reach places that medicine sometimes can't touch." Emma looked at George with the serious expression she sometimes got when she was thinking deeply about something important. "Mr. Strait, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart, anything." When you sing "I Cross My Heart," do you think about people who love each other even when things are really, really hard? George's expression softened. I think about exactly that, Emma. Love that doesn't give up, even when everything else feels impossible. That's what I thought, Emma said, wiping another tear from her cheek, because that's how I feel about my dad. He's been taking care of me even though it's really hard, and he never gives up on me, even when I'm sick and bald and not very much fun to be around. Daniel felt his composure cracking. Emma, honey, you're always fun to be around. You're the light of my life. George looked between father and daughter, and Daniel could see something profound happening in the country legend's eyes. A recognition of the depth of love and courage in this small hospital room. Emma, George said, I wonder if you'd like to hear something. I brought my guitar with me. Emma's eyes went impossibly wide. You want to sing for me? Only if you'd like me to. Yes, 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 Emma exclaimed, then caught herself and looked around the room. But wait, is it okay to play music in here? I don't want to get in trouble. Daniel stepped into the hallway and quickly found Jennifer Wilson, the head nurse. When he quietly explained the situation, her eyes went wide with disbelief, but she immediately began making arrangements. Room 517 is about to become very popular, she said with a smile. Let me see if some of the other children would like to join us. Within minutes, the hospital room had been transformed into an impromptu concert venue. Tyler was there, having been brought down from his room by his mother, a kind-faced woman named Carol Harrison who looked as stunned as everyone else. Several other young patients had been wheeled in, along with their parents and some of the medical staff. George tuned his guitar with the practiced ease of someone who had performed thousands of times, but Daniel could see that this audience was different for him. These weren't fans who had paid for tickets. These were children fighting battles they should never have to fight, and their families who loved them through every difficult moment. What would you like to hear first? George asked Emma. Amarillo Morning, she said without hesitation. That's the song that Tyler played, and it's the one that helped me not be scared the first night I was here. George began the familiar opening chords, and his voice filled the small room with warmth and hope. But what made the moment truly magical was that Emma began singing along, her clear, sweet voice harmonizing perfectly with the man she'd idolized from afar for so long. Tyler joined in from across the room, and soon several other children were humming along to the melody they'd learned just days earlier. The room was filled with music and joy and something that felt very much like healing. When the song ended, the room erupted in applause, but George held up his hand. I think, he said, looking directly at Emma, that was the most beautiful version of that song I've ever heard. Emma beamed with pride. Really? Really? Emma, would you like to sing another one with me? For the next hour, George Strait gave a private concert to a room full of children and families who needed hope more than their next breath. He played I Cross My Heart and Check Yes or No and All My Exes Live in Texas. He sang Blue Clear Sky and Carrying Your Love With Me. But the moment that broke everyone's heart came when he asked Emma if she had a special request. Could you play You Look So Good in Love? She asked quietly. My dad says that was playing when he and my mom got married, and I like to think about them dancing together when they were young and happy and didn't know that anything bad would ever happen. George's eyes met Daniel's across the room, and in that look was an understanding of loss and love and the way music could keep memories alive. As George played the gentle melody and sang about love that was beautiful to witness, Daniel watched his daughter close her eyes and sway slightly to the music. He could see her picturing parents she barely remembered, dancing to this very song in a time when the future held nothing but promise. When the song ended, Emma opened her eyes and looked directly at George. Thank you, she said simply. This is the best day I've had since I got sick. George set his guitar aside and reached for Emma's small hand. Emma, I want you to know something. I've been performing music for more than 40 years, and I've sung for presidents and kings and crowds of 80,000 people. But I have never, in all that time, sung for a braver or more special audience than I have today. Emma squeezed his hand. "Mr. Strait, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course." She leaned closer and whispered loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I'm going to get better, and when I do, I'm going to learn to play guitar just like Tyler, and I'm going to sing your songs for other kids who are scared and need to remember that there are still good things in the world." George's eyes filled with tears, and his voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. "Emma, I believe you're going to do exactly that. And when you do, I want you to remember that you already know the most important thing about music." "What's that?" "That it's not about being perfect. It's about sharing love." As the impromptu concert came to an end and the other families began to disperse, George spent a few more minutes talking quietly with Emma about music, about dreams, about the importance of staying hopeful, even when things seemed impossible. Tyler approached Emma's bed shyly, carrying his guitar case. "Emma," he said, "I wanted to give you something." He opened the case and pulled out a small harmonica. "My grandpa gave this to me when I first started playing music. He said it was for someone who understands that music is about healing people's hearts. I think you're that someone." Emma accepted the harmonica with reverence, as if it were made of gold rather than simple metal and wood. "Tyler, this is the most beautiful present anyone has ever given me," she said. "When we both get better, we're going to make the most amazing music together." George watched this exchange with deep interest. "Tyler, I heard about your concert the other day. Emma told me you played beautifully." Tyler ducked his head modestly. "I just played what my grandpa taught me." "Your grandpa sounds like a wise man. What else did he teach you?" "He said that music is like medicine, but it works on the parts of people that doctors can't reach." George nodded slowly. "Your grandpa was absolutely right." As the afternoon began to fade into evening, George knew he needed to leave for his meeting at the Bluebird Cafe. But first, he had something he needed to do. "Daniel," he said, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They stepped into the hallway, leaving Emma to show Tyler how the harmonica worked and to chat excitedly about everything that had just happened. "That is one remarkable little girl," George said. "She's my whole world," Daniel replied, his voice still thick with emotion from watching Emma's joy. "Daniel, I want to help." "Mr. Strait, what you did today, that was more help than you could possibly know. Emma will remember this for the rest of her life." "I'm talking about more than just a visit," George said gently. "I'm talking about her medical expenses, her treatment. Whatever you need to make sure she gets the best possible care." Daniel stared at him in shock. I can't accept. That's too much." "Daniel, listen to me. I've been blessed beyond measure in my life and career. I've been able to provide for my own family, to live comfortably, to pursue my dreams. But with great blessings come great responsibilities. And sometimes those responsibilities look like a little girl who loves music and needs help continuing her fight." Daniel felt tears streaming down his face. "Mr. Strait, I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me help. Say you'll let me be part of Emma's journey toward getting better." "Why?" Daniel asked. "Why would you do this for strangers?" George was quiet for a moment, looking through the doorway at Emma, who was attempting to play a simple melody on Tyler's harmonica while both children giggled at her efforts. "Because 30 years ago, I was a young father with a sick child, and I learned that when you're facing the unthinkable, the kindness of others isn't just helpful, it's everything. Because Emma reminds me of my own daughter at that age, full of hope and music and love despite everything she's facing. And because He paused, his voice growing softer, because sometimes God puts people in our path, not by accident, but because we're meant to help each other through the difficult times. Daniel was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this man's generosity and kindness. "There's one more thing," George continued. "I want Emma and Tyler to come to my show next month at the Grand Ole Opry. VIP treatment, backstage passes, the whole experience. They've both earned it. Mr. Strait, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me, Daniel. Just keep being the father you've been. Keep loving that little girl the way you do, and keep believing that her story is going to have a happy ending." They returned to Emma's room to find her and Tyler engaged in an animated discussion about their plans for their future musical collaborations. When Emma saw her father's tear-stained face, her expression grew concerned. "Daddy, are you okay? You look like you've been crying." Daniel knelt beside her bed and took her small hands in his. "I'm more than okay, sunshine. I'm grateful, more grateful than I've ever been in my life." Emma studied his face carefully. "Good grateful or overwhelmed grateful?" "The very best kind of grateful," Daniel assured her. George approached Emma's bed one more time. "Emma, I have to go now, but I want you to promise me something." "Anything, Mr. Strait. Promise me you'll keep singing. Promise me you'll keep believing in happy endings. And promise me you'll remember that you're braver and stronger than you know." "I promise," Emma said solemnly. "And Mr. Strait, thank you for making my dad cry the good kind of tears." George laughed and gently squeezed her hand. "You're welcome, sweetheart. I'll see you very soon." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Daniel realized that his life had fundamentally changed in the span of a single afternoon. Not just because of George's extraordinary generosity, but because he'd been reminded that goodness still existed in the world, that kindness could come from unexpected places, and that sometimes, when you least expect it, angels show up wearing cowboy hats and carrying guitars. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 4th time. He'd bought the shirt and tie specifically for tonight, the first new clothes he'd purchased for himself in over a year. But tonight was special. Tonight, Emma was going to see George Strait perform at the Grand Ole Opry. Emma had been doing better since George's visit, not just medically, though her doctors were encouraged by her recent test results, but emotionally and spiritually. She had a new lightness in her step, a renewed sense of hope that seemed to carry her through even the most difficult treatment days. She'd been practicing with Tyler's harmonica every day, and the two of them had become inseparable during her hospital visits. Tyler's family had decided to relocate to Nashville permanently to continue his treatment, and the friendship between the two children had blossomed into something beautiful and sustaining for both of them. "Dad, are you ready?" Emma called from the living room. "We don't want to be late." Daniel smiled at her excitement. She'd been talking about nothing else for weeks, planning her outfit, practicing the songs she hoped George might play, and generally living in a state of joyful anticipation that reminded Daniel of Christmas mornings when she was younger. He found her in the living room, wearing a new dress that George's assistant had sent over, a beautiful blue dress with small rhinestones that caught the light when she moved. She was wearing a matching headband instead of one of her usual bandanas, and Daniel was struck by how much she looked like her mother. "You look absolutely beautiful, sunshine," he said, kneeling down to straighten her collar. "Do you think Mr. Strait will remember us?" she asked, a tiny note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Emma, sweetheart, I don't think George Strait could forget you if he tried." Tyler and his mother, Carol, were meeting them at the Opry House. Tyler had been just as excited as Emma about the evening and had spent the past week learning every George Strait song he could find, hoping he might get a chance to play something backstage. The drive to the Grand Ole Opry was filled with Emma's chatter about everything she'd learned about the venue's history. She'd spent hours researching online, reading about all the legendary performers who had graced its stage, memorizing facts about the building's architecture and significance to country music. "Dad, did you know that the Opry has been running continuously since 1925, and that it started as a radio show called the WSM Barn Dance?" "I did not know that," Daniel replied, though he was only half listening. His mind was still processing the changes in their circumstances over the past few weeks. True to his word, George had taken care of Emma's medical expenses. Not just the immediate bills, but he'd established a fund to cover her treatment for as long as necessary. Daniel had tried to protest, to insist it was too much, but George had been adamant. "Music has given me everything I have," he'd said. "Let me give something back to someone who understands what music really means." The financial relief had been overwhelming. For the first time in months, Daniel could focus entirely on Emma's recovery rather than worrying about how to pay for it. He'd even been able to cut back on his Uber driving and spend more time with her during treatments. But more than the financial help, George's friendship had given them both something invaluable, a reminder that they weren't alone in their fight. The Grand Ole Opry house sat majestically against the Nashville skyline, its red brick facade and distinctive architecture immediately recognizable to anyone who loved country music. As they pulled into the VIP parking area, Emma pressed her face against the window in wonder. "It's even more beautiful than in the pictures," she breathed. They were met at the stage door by George's tour manager, a friendly woman named Linda, who immediately made them feel welcome and important. "George is so excited to see you both," she said, as she led them through the backstage corridors. "He's been talking about this evening all week." The backstage area of the Grand Ole Opry was a maze of hallways, dressing rooms, and equipment storage areas. Photos of country music legends lined the walls, and Emma stopped to look at each one, reading the names aloud and sharing what she knew about each performer. "Look, Dad, there's Patsy Cline and Johnny Cash, and oh my gosh, there's Dolly Parton." Tyler and Carol were waiting in George's dressing room, and Tyler immediately ran to show Emma the new song he'd learned. "I can play Carrying Your Love With Me Now," he announced proudly. "Want to hear it?" As Tyler played, Daniel noticed George watching from the doorway, still wearing his street clothes, but with that unmistakable presence that marked him as someone truly special. He caught Daniel's eye and smiled. "They sound good together," he said quietly. "They've been practicing constantly," Daniel replied. "Emma carries that harmonica everywhere now." George stepped into the room and was immediately engulfed by Emma's enthusiastic hug. "Mr. Strait, I can't believe we're really here. This is the most amazing place I've ever seen." "Wait until you see it from the stage," George said with a grin. "Speaking of which, I have a surprise for you and Tyler." Both children looked at him expectantly. "How would you two like to come out on stage with me tonight, just for one song?" Emma's mouth fell open. Tyler nearly dropped his guitar. "Are you serious?" Emma whispered. "Completely serious. I was thinking we could do Amarillo Morning together. Tyler on guitar, Emma on harmonica, and all of us singing. What do you think?" Emma burst into tears, the happy kind that had become familiar over the past few weeks. Tyler just nodded vigorously, too overcome to speak. "But there will be thousands of people out there," Emma said through her tears. "What if I mess up?" George knelt down to her level. "Emma, do you remember what I told you about music at the hospital? That it's not about being perfect. It's about sharing love." "Exactly. And that audience out there, they're going to love you just for being brave enough to share your music with them." The next hour passed in a blur of sound checks, costume fittings, and gentle coaching from George about where to stand and when to come in with their parts. Emma was fitted with a wireless microphone and given specific instructions about how to hold Tyler's harmonica close enough to be heard. As showtime approached, Daniel could see Emma's nervousness increasing, but it was mixed with an excitement that made her practically glow. "Dad," she said as they waited in the wings, "whatever happens out there, this is already the best night of my life." Daniel hugged her close. "Mine too, sunshine, mine too." The Grand Ole Opry house was sold out. 4,400 people filling every seat, their excitement palpable even from backstage. When George was introduced and walked out to thunderous applause, Daniel felt a surge of pride for his friend, this man who could command such respect and adoration, but who had chosen to spend his time caring about a sick little girl and her struggling father. George's performance was masterful, as always. He played his classics and some newer material, and the audience was completely captivated. But Daniel knew the real magic was yet to come. About halfway through the show, George paused between songs. "Folks, I want to tell you about something special that happened to me a few weeks ago," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the venue. "I was taking an Uber ride here in Nashville, just going about my business, when I met a driver named Daniel and learned about his daughter, Emma." Daniel felt his heart begin to race as George continued. "Emma is 12 years old, and she's been fighting leukemia for the past 8 months. But Emma and her father are two of the bravest, most inspiring people I've ever had the privilege to meet. And Emma, along with her friend Tyler, reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Music isn't just entertainment, folks. It's medicine for the soul. It's hope when hope is hard to find. It's connection when we feel isolated. And sometimes it's magic. George turned toward the wings and gestured for Emma and Tyler to join him. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet two very special young people who are going to help me with the next song. Please welcome Emma Matthews and Tyler Harrison." The applause was deafening as Emma and Tyler walked out onto the stage. Daniel watched from the wings as Emma looked out at the vast audience, her eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. Tyler carried his guitar with the confidence of someone much older, and both children moved to their designated spots as if they belonged there. "This song," George said, "is called Amarillo Morning, and it's about hope and new beginnings. But tonight, it's about courage and friendship and the power of music to heal." As the familiar opening chords filled the Opry house, Daniel felt tears streaming down his face. But these weren't tears of sadness or worry. They were tears of pure joy and pride. Emma's voice, clear and sweet and absolutely fearless, joined George's as they sang about morning bringing new hope and the promise that everything would be all right. Tyler's guitar playing was perfect, each note ringing true and adding to the magic of the moment. But what made the performance truly transcendent was the way all three performers looked at each other as they sang, with genuine affection, mutual respect, and shared understanding of what music could accomplish when it came from the heart. When the song ended, the Grand Ole Opry house erupted in an ovation that seemed to go on forever. The audience was on their feet, many of them crying, all of them recognizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. George pulled both children into a hug, and as the three of them took their bow together, Daniel realized that this moment would be etched in his memory forever, not just because his daughter was performing at the Grand Ole Opry, but because it represented hope, healing, and the kindness of a man who had chosen to use his platform to lift up others. As Emma and Tyler waved to the crowd one final time and walked back toward the wings, Emma caught her father's eye and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Daniel wiped his eyes and mouthed back, "I love you, sunshine." The rest of George's performance was brilliant, but Daniel's mind kept returning to the image of Emma on that stage, fearless and joyful, sharing her light with 4,000 strangers who had immediately fallen in love with her courage. After the show, they gathered again in George's dressing room, where both children were still buzzing with excitement and adrenaline. "That was incredible," Emma exclaimed. "I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, but it wasn't scary. It was like flying." "You were both perfect," George said. Absolutely perfect. Tyler was carefully putting his guitar back in its case, but his hands were shaking slightly with excitement. Mr. Strait, thank you for letting us be part of your show. This is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. The pleasure was all mine, George assured him. You two are naturals. Have you thought about pursuing music seriously? Emma and Tyler looked at each other, and Emma spoke for both of them. We want to keep playing together, especially for other kids who are sick or scared. Tyler's grandpa was right. Music is medicine for the parts that doctors can't reach. George nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right reason to make music. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave, George pulled Daniel aside once more. How is she doing? Really? Better, Daniel said honestly. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. Her latest scans showed significant improvement and her white blood cell counts have been much better. And how are you doing? Daniel thought about the question. A month ago, he would have said he was barely surviving, held together by worry and determination and little else. But now, I'm hopeful, he said. For the first time in months, I'm actually hopeful about the future. Good, George said. Hope is powerful medicine too. As they walked to their cars in the VIP parking area, Emma clutched her framed photo from the evening, a picture of her, Tyler and George on the Opry stage that would undoubtedly become one of her most treasured possessions. Dad, she said as they drove home through the quiet Nashville streets, do you think Mom would have been proud of me tonight? Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. Sunshine, I think your mother would have been the proudest person in that entire auditorium. I think she would have been cheering so loud that everyone around her would have known exactly which little girl on stage belonged to her. Emma smiled contentedly and rested her head against the window. I felt like she was there tonight. When I was singing, I felt like she was listening. I think she was, Daniel said softly. I think she's been listening all along. As they pulled into their driveway, Daniel reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed. Not just because of George's generosity, though that had been life-changing, but because they'd been reminded that they weren't alone in the world, that kindness existed, that people cared about each other, even strangers. Emma was already asleep by the time he carried her into the house, still wearing her blue dress and clutching the harmonica that had become her most prized possession. As he tucked her into bed, she stirred slightly. Dad? Yes, sunshine? Tonight was perfect, but you know what the best part was? What was that? Seeing you smile like you used to when Mom was alive. That made me happier than anything else. Daniel kissed her forehead gently. Sweet dreams, Emma. Tomorrow is going to be another good day. As he turned off her light and closed her door, Daniel realized she was right. He was smiling like he used to. For the first time in years, the future felt full of possibility rather than uncertainty. Emma was getting better. They had financial security, and they'd been reminded that the world contained far more good than bad. Most importantly, they'd learned that sometimes, when you least expect it, magic happens. And sometimes, that magic comes in the form of a country music legend who recognizes that true greatness isn't measured by album sales or awards, but by the willingness to use your gifts to lift up others. George Strait had given them more than money or a memorable evening. He'd given them hope, friendship, and proof that kindness could still change the world, one heart at a time. 6 months later, Daniel sat in the waiting room of Vanderbilt Children's Hospital, but this time was different from all the others. Today, they weren't here for treatment. Today, they were here for Emma's final follow-up appointment. And if the tests came back as expected, she would officially be declared in remission. Emma was fidgeting in the chair beside him, not from nervousness, but from excitement. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt that read, "Music heals everything," a gift from George that had become her favorite. Her hair had grown back, thick and curly, and she no longer needed the colorful bandanas that had been her trademark during treatment. "Dad, do you think Dr. Peterson will really say, 'I'm all better today'?" she asked for the 10th time in an hour. "I think there's a very good chance of that, sunshine," Daniel replied, though his own nerves were getting the better of him. After 8 months of treatments and 2 months of anxious waiting, this moment felt almost too good to be true. Tyler was there with them, along with his mother Carol. Tyler had officially been declared in remission 3 weeks earlier, and his family had decided to make Nashville their permanent home. The friendship between the two children had only grown stronger, and they'd begun performing together regularly at local hospitals and charity events. They'd even recorded a small album together, just 5 songs, but professionally produced in a studio that George had arranged for them. The proceeds from sales went directly to the Pediatric Oncology Fund at Vanderbilt, and it had already raised enough money to help several families with treatment costs. "Emma Matthews," a nurse called from the doorway. Daniel's heart jumped, but Emma stood up calmly and confidently. She'd grown up a lot over the past months, not just physically, but emotionally. The scared little girl who had first walked into this hospital had been replaced by a young woman who understood both the fragility and the resilience of life. Dr. Patricia Peterson was waiting for them in her office, and the smile on her face told Daniel everything he needed to know before she said a word. "Emma," Dr. Peterson said, "I have some very good news for you." Emma reached for Daniel's hand and squeezed it tightly. "Your latest scans are completely clear. Your blood work is perfect. All of your tests indicate that you are officially in complete remission." The words hung in the air for a moment as Daniel processed their meaning. Complete remission. No more treatments. No more weekly hospital visits. No more fear of the future. Emma burst into tears, but they were the happiest tears Daniel had ever seen her cry. "So I'm really better. Really, truly better." "Really, truly better," Dr. Peterson confirmed. "You'll still need regular checkups for the next few years, but as far as we can determine, you have beaten this thing completely." Daniel felt his own tears flowing freely now. After months of cautious hope, careful optimism, and persistent worry, he could finally allow himself to believe that his daughter was going to be okay. "Thank you," he said to Dr. Peterson, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything you've done for her." "It was my privilege," Dr. Peterson replied. "Emma has been one of my favorite patients ever. Her positive attitude and determination have been an inspiration to everyone on the staff." As they left the hospital for what would hopefully be the last time as patients, Emma was practically bouncing with excitement. "Dad, we have to call Mr. Strait. We have to tell Tyler. We have to celebrate." "We'll do all of those things," Daniel promised. "But first, I want to take you somewhere special." He drove them to Centennial Park, to the same bench where he'd sat with Emma the day she was first diagnosed, trying to figure out how to explain to a 12-year-old that her world was about to change in ways neither of them could imagine. "Do you remember this place?" he asked as they sat down together. Emma looked around thoughtfully. "This is where you told me about the cancer, isn't it?" "It is. And I wanted us to come back here today because I wanted to tell you something in the same place where our journey began." Emma waited patiently for him to continue. "Emma, I have watched you face the most difficult challenge anyone should ever have to face, and you did it with more courage, grace, and optimism than most adults could manage. You never gave up hope. You never stopped believing in good outcomes, and you never lost your love for music or your compassion for other people." Daniel paused, gathering his thoughts. "But most importantly, you taught me that even in the darkest times, there are still reasons to be grateful. You showed me that love really can conquer fear, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most difficult circumstances." Emma leaned against his shoulder. "Dad, can I tell you something?" Always. I'm glad this happened to us. Daniel was startled by her words. Emma, why would you say that? Because if I hadn't gotten sick, we never would have met Mr. Strait. Tyler never would have become my best friend. We never would have learned how strong we really are. And we never would have found out how many people care about us, even people we'd never met before. Daniel marveled at his daughter's wisdom. At 13, she'd already learned lessons about gratitude, resilience, and the interconnectedness of human experience that many people never learned at all. Plus, Emma continued, now I know what I want to do with my life. What's that, sunshine? I want to use music to help other kids who are going through what Tyler and I went through. I want to show them that being sick doesn't mean you have to stop dreaming, and that music really can make everything a little bit better. Daniel smiled, thinking about how perfectly that goal suited his remarkable daughter. That evening, they gathered at the Bluebird Cafe for what had become their monthly tradition. George had arranged for Emma and Tyler to perform one song each month at the venue's songwriter nights, giving them experience performing for intimate audiences and helping them develop their skills as musicians. Tonight was special, though. Tonight was Emma's celebration of remission, and George had planned something extraordinary. The Bluebird Cafe was packed with familiar faces. Tyler and his family were there, of course, along with several nurses and doctors from Vanderbilt Children's Hospital. Jennifer Wilson sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Even Dr. Peterson had come, taking a rare evening away from the hospital to celebrate one of her favorite success stories. But as Daniel looked around the room, he realized that George had invited much more than their immediate circle. There were other families there, parents and children he recognized from the hospital, people who were still in the middle of their own battles with pediatric cancer. Emma noticed them too, and Daniel watched as she made her way around the room before the show started, introducing herself to the other children, asking about their treatments, sharing encouragement and hope. "That's quite a young lady you've raised," said a voice behind Daniel. He turned to find George approaching, carrying his guitar case as always. "She gets that from her mother," Daniel replied. "Sarah always had a gift for making other people feel valued and heard. And she gets her strength from her father," George countered. "Don't sell yourself short, Daniel. What you've done for Emma, the way you've supported her through all of this, that's heroic." Daniel shook his head. "I just did what any parent would do." "No," George said firmly. "You did what the best parents do. There's a difference." As the evening's performances began, Daniel found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a desperate man driving for Uber, trying to figure out how to pay for his daughter's cancer treatment. Tonight, he was watching that same daughter prepare to perform at one of Nashville's most prestigious venues, healthy and happy and full of dreams for the future. The other performers that night included several established Nashville songwriters, and Emma and Tyler were scheduled to close the show. As the evening progressed, Daniel could see Emma growing more confident and excited. When their time came, Emma and Tyler took the small stage hand in hand. Tyler had his grandfather's old guitar, and Emma carried the harmonica that had become her constant companion. "Hi, everyone," Emma said into the microphone, her voice clear and confident. "I'm Emma Matthews, and this is my best friend Tyler Harrison. 6 months ago, we met in a hospital room where we were both receiving treatment for cancer. The room was completely silent, everyone hanging on her words. We learned that music has incredible power, the power to comfort people who are scared, to bring hope when things seem impossible, and to remind us that we're never really alone in our struggles." Emma looked directly at the other children in the audience, the ones who were still fighting their own battles. "Tonight, Tyler and I want to dedicate our song to every kid who's ever been told they're sick, and to every parent who's ever felt helpless watching their child suffer. This song is called Amarillo Morning, and it's about new beginnings and the promise that everything is going to be all right." As they began to play, Daniel felt the same magic he'd experienced that first day in the hospital room when Tyler had played for the other children. But this was different, stronger, more intentional, infused with the wisdom that came from having walked through fire and emerged on the other side. Emma's voice soared over Tyler's guitar, and when she played the harmonica solo, the sound was hauntingly beautiful. But what made the performance truly transcendent was the way they looked at the other children in the audience as they sang, making each one feel personally included in their message of hope. When they finished, the applause was thunderous, but Emma wasn't done. "There's someone here tonight who changed our lives," she said, looking directly at George. "Mr. George Strait, would you come up here and sing with us?" George looked surprised. This hadn't been planned, but he immediately rose from his seat and joined them on stage. "What would you like to sing?" he asked quietly. "I Cross My Heart," Emma replied without hesitation, "because that's the song that reminds me that love never gives up, even when everything else seems impossible." As the three of them performed together, Daniel looked around the room and saw something beautiful happening. Children who had been scared and uncertain were smiling. Parents who had been carrying impossible burdens were crying tears of hope rather than despair. Medical professionals who dealt with life and death every day were reminded of why they had chosen their calling. But most importantly, Daniel saw Emma fully inhabiting her purpose. She wasn't just performing music, she was using music to heal, to inspire, to connect people who might otherwise feel isolated in their struggles. When the song ended, George pulled both children into a hug, and the three of them stood together as the audience rose to their feet in sustained applause. "Emma," George said into the microphone, "when I first met you, you were a brave little girl fighting a terrible disease. Tonight, I see a young woman who has found her calling. You're going to change lives with your music." Emma wiped tears from her eyes and stepped back to the microphone. "Mr. Strait, you saved our lives in more ways than one. But more than that, you showed us that when people use their gifts to help others, magic happens. Tyler and I promise that we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to pass that magic on to other people who need it." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Daniel found himself surrounded by other parents, thanking him for sharing Emma's story, asking for advice about how to help their own children maintain hope during treatment. One mother approached him with tears in her eyes. "My daughter is 8 years old and was just diagnosed with leukemia last month," she said. "Watching Emma tonight, it gave me hope that my little girl can not only survive this, but thrive." Daniel thought about all the nights he'd lain awake, wondering if Emma would live to see her next birthday, let alone grow up to pursue her dreams. "Your daughter is going to be okay," he said, with the confidence of someone who had walked this path and emerged on the other side. "It's going to be hard, and there will be days when you don't think you can take another step, but love really is stronger than fear, and hope really can sustain you through anything." As they prepared to leave the Bluebird Cafe, George pulled Daniel aside one final time. "I want you to know something," he said. "Oh, Emma and Tyler have inspired me to start a foundation, the Amarillo Morning Foundation. It's going to provide financial assistance to families dealing with pediatric cancer, but more than that, it's going to fund music therapy programs in children's hospitals across the country." Daniel was overwhelmed by the scope of George's vision. "That's incredible. Emma's going to be so excited when she hears about it." "She's going to be more than excited," George said with a smile. "She's going to be the Foundation's first youth ambassador. She and Tyler both, if they're interested." Daniel looked over at Emma, who was still surrounded by other children and their families, sharing contact information and promising to stay in touch, making plans to visit them during their treatments. "I think they'd be honored," Daniel said. As they finally made their way to their cars, Emma was practically glowing with happiness and purpose. "Dad," she said as they drove home, "tonight felt like everything came full circle, didn't it?" "What do you mean, sunshine?" Well, it started with you driving Mr. Strait in your Uber, and look how it ended, with all of us together, using music to help other families like ours. Daniel considered her words. She was right. It did feel like coming full circle, but it was more than that. It felt like the beginning of something even bigger. Emma, do you remember what you told me at the park today? About being glad this happened to us? Yeah. I think I understand what you meant now. Not that I'm glad you got sick. I would never be glad about that. But I'm grateful for what we learned, for the people we met, for the way we discovered what really matters in life. Emma nodded thoughtfully. And I'm grateful that we found out we're stronger than we thought we were. We are, Daniel agreed. We really are. As they pulled into their driveway, Daniel reflected on the incredible year they'd had. Emma was healthy, they were financially secure, and they'd found their purpose in helping other families navigate the same journey they'd completed successfully. But more than any of that, they'd learned that sometimes the most devastating circumstances can lead to the most beautiful outcomes. That kindness from strangers can change everything. That music really can heal the parts of people that medicine can't reach. And that sometimes when you're drowning in despair and can't see any way forward, an angel shows up wearing a cowboy hat, carrying a guitar, and reminds you that your story isn't over. It's just beginning. 3 months later, Daniel received a phone call that would once again change their lives. Mr. Matthews, this is Rebecca Chen from Good Morning America. We've heard about your daughter Emma and her friendship with George Strait, and we'd love to have all of you on the show to talk about the power of music in healing. Daniel looked over at Emma, who was sitting at the kitchen table working on her homework while humming a new song she and Tyler were writing for their next hospital visit. Can I call you back? Daniel asked. I need to check with my daughter first. Emma looked up when he mentioned her name. Good Morning America wants to interview us about our story with George, he explained. Emma's eyes lit up, but then she grew thoughtful. Dad, would it help other families who are going through what we went through? I think it might, Sunshine. Then yes, she said without hesitation. If our story can help even one family feel less alone, then we should definitely do it. Daniel called Rebecca back and scheduled the interview. 2 weeks later, they were sitting on a couch in a New York television studio, with Emma confidently answering questions about her cancer journey, her friendship with Tyler, and her relationship with George Strait. Emma? The host asked, what would you say to other children who are facing serious illnesses? Emma thought for a moment, then looked directly into the camera. I would tell them that being sick doesn't mean you have to stop dreaming. It doesn't mean your story is over. It just means it's going to be different than you planned, and maybe even more beautiful than you imagined. And I would tell them that music really can make everything better, even when everything seems impossible. The host turned to Daniel. And what would you say to parents who are watching their children suffer? Daniel's voice was steady and sure when he answered. I would tell them that love really is stronger than fear, that hope is not naive, it's necessary. And that sometimes when you think you're at the end of your rope, that's exactly when angels show up to remind you that you're not alone. After the interview aired, Daniel's phone rang constantly for weeks. Families from across the country reached out, sharing their own stories, asking for advice, expressing gratitude for the hope that Emma's story had given them. Emma and Tyler started a YouTube channel where they performed songs and talked about their experiences with cancer. The Amarillo Morning Foundation grew beyond George's wildest expectations, helping hundreds of families and funding music therapy programs in over 50 hospitals. But perhaps most importantly, Emma had found her calling. At 14, she was already performing regularly at hospitals, conferences, and charity events. She'd written a book about her experience called Music, Hope, and Healing that became a bestseller, with all proceeds going to pediatric cancer research. One evening, almost exactly 2 years after that first Uber ride, Daniel was driving through Nashville when his phone chimed with a ride request. He glanced at the pickup location and smiled. Ocean Way Studios. The passenger name was listed as J. Smith. Daniel arrived at the studio to find George waiting by the entrance, guitar case in hand, that familiar smile on his face. "Well, well," George said as he settled into the back seat. "Fancy meeting you here." "Where to today, Mr. Smith?" Daniel asked with a grin. "Surprise me," George replied. "I trust your judgment completely." As they drove through the streets of Nashville, Daniel realized that his life had become something he never could have imagined during those dark months when Emma was first diagnosed. He still drove for Uber occasionally, but now it was by choice rather than necessity. He'd written his own book about their experience from a father's perspective, and he'd become a sought-after speaker at medical conferences and support groups. But more than any professional success, he had the profound satisfaction of knowing that their story had helped countless other families find hope during their darkest hours. "How's Emma doing?" George asked, as he always did. "She's incredible," Daniel replied. "She just got accepted to Belmont University's music therapy program. She wants to become a certified music therapist so she can work in children's hospitals." "That doesn't surprise me at all," George said. "That girl was born to heal people through music, and Tyler's doing well too." His family decided to start a non-profit organization that provides instruments to children in hospitals. They're calling it Grandpa's Guitar Foundation. George laughed. "Those two are going to change the world, aren't they?" "They already are," Daniel said, "one song at a time." As they continued driving through Nashville, Daniel thought about the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with desperation and fear, but it had led to purpose, hope, and a profound understanding of what really mattered in life. Emma was healthy and thriving. They had financial security and meaningful work. They'd found their calling in helping others navigate difficult circumstances, but most importantly, they'd learned that even in the darkest times, there were reasons to be grateful. That love really could conquer fear. That music had the power to heal. And that sometimes, when you least expected it, angels showed up in the most ordinary circumstances and reminded you that your story was far from over. "You know what, George?" Daniel said as they pulled up to the Grand Ole Opry house where Emma and Tyler were rehearsing for another benefit concert. "What's that? I think this might be the beginning of our most beautiful chapter yet." George smiled as he got out of the car. "Daniel, my friend, I think you're absolutely right." As Daniel watched George walk into the Opry house to join Emma and Tyler for their rehearsal, he realized that the most important lesson they'd learned wasn't about music or medicine or even hope. It was about the extraordinary power of human kindness to transform lives and the responsibility that came with being blessed to pass that kindness on to others who needed it. His phone chimed with another ride request, and Daniel smiled as he accepted it. Another passenger, another story, another opportunity to make a connection that might change someone's day, or maybe even their life. Because he'd learned that magic didn't just happen to other people. Sometimes it happened to ordinary folks who were willing to recognize angels when they appeared, and brave enough to believe that even the most difficult circumstances could lead to the most beautiful outcomes. The story of Daniel and Emma Matthews, Tyler Harrison and George Strait became legendary in Nashville and beyond, not because it was a fairy tale, but because it was proof that real magic existed in the world, and that ordinary people could access that magic through love, hope, courage, and the willingness to use their gifts to lift up others. And somewhere in Nashville, on any given day, you might find yourself in an Uber, driven by a man who learned that angels sometimes wear cowboy hats, and that the most beautiful music comes from hearts that have been broken and healed and are dedicated to helping others do the same.